You're listening to If These Woods Could Talk, produced by the Rhinelander District Library. More information can be found at rhinelanderlibrary.org. Now follow If These Woods Could Talk on Facebook and Instagram for new episodes, other history blurbs, and civil discussion. Subscribe to These Woods on your podcast platform of choice to get new episodes as they are released. If These Woods Could Talk, they might tell you about a rowboat with Rhinelander written all over it. When he was a teen in the 40s, Glynn Bud Roberts' family bought a resort in Arbor Vitae. Bud talked about the resort and other memories of the Northwoods, including trips to the Rhinelander Boat Company. Check it out.
If these words could talk, would you sit and listen to tales of those who came before us in the virgin pines with the river glistening? Sit on back with friendlies, share some stories about butterflies, days gone by on the sunset hill of glory.
I'm Glynn Roberts. Almost everybody knows me as Bud because I was a junior, and rather than being called something like Chip or Sonny or whatever, I became Bud. So,
There we go.
and I'm retired. I formerly worked for the Conservation Department for about 13 years plus 7 summers for the DNR, and then went into teaching industrial arts and adult education. Mainly woodworking, drafting, plastics, that sort of thing.
Where were you born?
Actually, I was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, down in the southeast corner, and migrated northward when my folks bought a resort in 1944 in Arbor Vitae.
What was the resort called?
Blue Island Resort. In fact, it still goes by that name, but it's mostly condoed now.
So then about how old were you when you moved up?
About 16.
About 16.
1944, right during the midst of the war, World War II. And there were difficult years, a lot of rationing and shortage of gasoline and so forth, which my parents had to deal with.
Yeah, with a lake resort, how do you deal with the shortages of gasoline? I imagine that's a big deal.
People saved up their coupons and, merged, came together a lot more than they, drove up separately. Few came by train. We didn't really have very good bus service at that time. I don't recall much bus service. There are all kinds of shortages as far as copper because of the war, the need for copper and munitions and all kinds of things. And as a result, we didn't get electricity until 1950. And 1950, finally things were easing up. More copper was available for wiring and transformers and all the necessary parts of providing rural electrification. And so in the meantime, we had to use a light plant. There again, with rationing, it affected how many hours a day we could run it. We would start it at 7 o'clock, the light plant, and at 11 o'clock, a little alarm clock, a Rube Goldberg arrangement would shut it off at 11. The whole resort would go black, and people would have to revert to kerosene lamps in each cottage. And very often they forgot to plan for that, and they'd be stumbling around looking for flashlights and lanterns and whatnot.
I'm sure. So when we talk about the resort then, what kind of duties did you have?
Well, most of it came most busy on the weekends because that was a changeover day. And people, having stayed a week or 2 weeks, would be packing up and leaving, and the new parties would be coming in. So preparations had to be done for cleaning the cottages, which my mother mostly did, sometimes with some additional help, and cleaning the boats. At that time, without electricity, we put up 300 cakes of ice every winter, and I had put ice in a Model A station wagon that I hauled ice up to each cottage and would fill the ice box with it, and that provided their cooling for their food. And we had an ice house where they could store their fish in little graves on top of the ice and covered up with sawdust until they were ready to go home or consume the fish. And garbage had to be gathered and hauled out into a dump. And but the boat cleaning was always a big must because people had used it previously, sometimes left a dirty boat. Most of the time not too bad. But I talk about one, I remember one instance very clearly, and that was a party would come all the way from Stevens Point just for the day fishing. And they would bring a big box of kind of heavy clay type soil filled with angleworms and night crawlers. They had the habit of just dumping in the bottom of the boat. And with the bottom of the boat being, the interior had little oak rails, which were floorboards, and all this would accumulate underneath, wedge into every opening there was. And so when I had to clean them, it meant carrying pails of water from the pier and sloshing it into the boat, which was turned on its side and propped up with a sawhorse, and no hoses or power washing, until later when we got electricity. So I always remember that party when they drove in and, oh boy, I'm going to have a dirty boat to deal with today again.
Perfect.
And rental was like $2 for the day.
Hmm.
If the cottages people wanted a second boat, it would be $5 for the week. And that was the going rate. And we had a variety of boats through the years. The previous owner, a widow from Blue Island, Illinois, which was how the resort got its name. And she was trying to manage it on her own and using the guests as helpers as far as painting boats and all these different things. And
Yeah.
so we inherited boats with 3 or 4 layers of additional paint, and had to be burned off with a blowtorch and scraped and recaulked. And so we were dealing with that over a period of a couple of years until we could start getting boats. And of course, boats, like everything else, required materials that were in competition with the war effort. And as a result, you just couldn't get a lot of things, like even the hardware for oarlocks and things like that, and for the oars themselves. And so a lot of that stuff just had to be on hold until the war was over. So we struggled along with these older boats, and finally the Rhinelander Boat came into the picture. And
Rhinelander Boat.
the Rhinelander Boat. And it was down on, the location of the factory was down on Ocala Street on the west end. It's not there any longer. I think it's a paper mill property now. And the back end of the lot was on the Pelican River. And it was a fascinating place when we finally got around to ordering a boat one fall. We came back in the spring to pick it up, went down with a car and a little 2-wheel trailer, and the boat factory was fronted on Ocala Street, and it had about, I remember, maybe about 4 doors, something like garage doors, and they'd be open in summertime when the fellows were working on these boats. And they had these inverted forms that had metal strips on like ribs, and they'd build it over the top of that out of matched cedar strips. And they had like a tongue and groove form edges, so they just met, and with the swelling of the wood in water would make a watertight seal without caulking, any wicking or anything like that. And as a result, they were a very nice, smooth, easily clean boat. And my first experience going into the place, I can still remember very vividly, and that was the odor. A lot of industrial odors are not pleasant, but going into that place, I really enjoyed it because it was a combination of the cedar, which is very aromatic, and the oak, and then, of course, linseed oil, turpentine, the boat enamels themselves, and all blended together as you walked in. It just hit me, and I thought, oh man, this, because I like woodworking, and that, it just really, I can't forget that smell. It was so good. Anyway, they would be assembling these boats and with copper clout nails, and as the nails were driven through the planking and through the inside rib, they would clinch over when they hit the metal strip on the form underneath. So they didn't have to turn it over and clinch, bend over each individual copper nail. And they had quite an operation going there, and there'd be a couple rows of these fellows working on these things. And then, of course, painting them. And they had a store building across the road. It was 2-story, and they'd store all these finished boats there waiting for the owners, or prospective owners. And as we'd go in there, we'd go in the office, and this older gentleman, I don't recall his name anymore. It was a Scandinavian name of some kind. I remember it ended in S-O-N, that's the best I can remember. And a very nice man, kind of quiet. And he'd go to his stand-up desk and get his card file out, and we'd tell him our name, and he said, okay, we got to go across the street, and we go over there, and they had an electric hoist, and they could lift boats from the lower or upper and load them onto your vehicle or trailer. And every time we went there, he'd have our card, and he could be looking at tags on each of the boats, and he never seemed to be able to find our boat. But he'd say, well, let's see. Now this party, they're not coming in until August, let's say. And so we can take this one. This is the same model as you ordered. His bookkeeping system always had a flaw in it, almost every year when we went there. And so we knew we could expect that to happen. But it was a fine boat, and I think they cost like $125, $135 at the most. And they were very smooth. They were, the upper, the inside would be varnished natural, so you'd see the cedar. And the exterior had kind of forest green enamel, a couple of coats of that on the outside. And the gunnel around the edge was oak, finished natural with varnish. Now if you bought a kind of a deluxe model, you got a spray rail with it. The spray rail went around the outside. That was the dividing point between the green below, and then it was white in between the gunnel and the spray rail all the way around. Very attractive. And they had different models. We always got a 14-footer. They made 15.5, 16-foot models also. And a little bit more classy ones that we didn't need or could afford. But it was a fun place to visit.
Are these like rowboats? Are they?
Yeah,
lighter?
they're strictly a resort rowboat, yeah. And they would handle a fair-sized motor up to maybe 10, 12 horsepower motor. But motors were very scarcely used because of the war situation, the gasoline, lack of metal, no new models coming out. And if you saw a motor on a boat, if somebody brought one, it would be a maximum of maybe a 4.5 or 5 horsepower. And there'd be some 1.5 little Evinrudes and Johnsons, mainly. And then the Mercury came on the scene, And they had what they called a 6-horse, but everybody swore it had to be at least a 10-horse because it had so much more pep than the others, comparable motors. And they were very, very popular when available as the war ended. And, you know,
Are you able to estimate, I mean, size-wise, what kind of an operation was this?
oh, well, they probably never had more than 3 or 4 lines of boats in process, you know, being assembled and finished, painted, and so forth. And there usually be at least 1 or 2 employees working on each line on these boats, you know.
Okay.
It wasn't a fast-moving, you know, a production line of any kind. And the building was just a frame building, and it was probably, if you placed about 4 or 5 single stall garages side by side, it would have a width of maybe 50, 60 feet wide. And I never got way back into it, but it had other places for storage, you know, hardware and paint and whatnot within the building. And behind it, like I said, there was a vacant area that went right up to the Pelican River. And it was right at the bottom of the hill. And then across the street, of course, was this 2-story building, frame building, much taller. And that's where they stored their finished products, waiting to be picked up.
And there will be more Bud Roberts to come in the near future. Thanks for listening to If These Woods Could Talk. To record your own story, stop by the Rhinelander District Library. Call the library at 715-365-1070 or send an email to thesewoods@rhinelanderlibrary.org.